Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host Ricardo Lopes and today I'm joined by Dr. J. Belsky. He is Robert and Natalie Reed Dorne Professor of Human Development in the Department of Human Ecology and Program in Human Development at the University of California, Davis. Professor Belsky is an internationally recognized expert in the field of child development and family studies. His areas of expertise include the effects of daycare, parent-child relations during the infancy and early childhood years, including attachment, the transition to parenthood, the etiology of child maltreatment, and the evolutionary basis of parent and child functioning. He is a founding and collaborating investigator on the NICHD study of childcare and youth development in the US and the National Evaluation of Sure Start in the UK. Finally, he is also the author of more than 300 scientific articles and chapters and the author and editor of several books. So, Dr. Belsky, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
My pleasure.
Okay, so the first question I would like to ask you, and since we're going to talk about parent-child relationships today and child development is, what is the evolutionary basis of parent-offspring conflict?
Well, I think in some ways we have to distinguish kind of an Enlightenment view of children and an evolutionary view of children. Okay. The Enlightenment view of children is more or less that children should grow up naturally to be secure, autonomous, achievement striving, capable of having intimate relations, caring well for their own children when the time comes, as long as they're brought up tolerably well. And it's only when things go wrong that such developments are disrupted, dysregulated, or disordered. The evolutionary perspective, in contrast, says that's a naive, romanticized view of children. Children aren't designed to grow up this way or that way without consideration of the context in which they develop and their genetics. So in some case, it's perfectly natural, appropriate, strategic, even if we don't like it, for children to grow up insecure, dependent, hostile, aggressive, incapable of forming intimate, enduring pair bonds, investing poorly in their own children when the time comes. So fundamentally, the notion is that we've idealized child development instead of seeing it in a more evolutionary perspective, that is, recognizing that we are a life form like all other life forms in some fundamental ways. And that is to say that the most important thing to all living things is the passing on of genes to the next generation. So we have to appreciate, however, and this is another contrast with the Enlightenment view, is that the relationship between parent and child is not perfectly harmonious. Mothers, or fathers for that matter, aren't designed by nature to love unconditionally their progeny. They're strategic investors. Mm-hmm. When what they do can yield a return on their efforts in terms of fostering reproductive fitness, that is, the dispersion of genes in future generations, then they behave in that way. At times that may mean pushing children away, being hostile to children, and thereby developing a opportunistic advantage taker rather than somebody who pursues mutually beneficial reciprocal relations. In other words, parent and child fundamentally don't have the same agenda. And the reason for that is because they don't share 100% of their genes. They only share 50% of their genes. So what parents want and what the child wants may not be the same, i.e., they may be in conflict. So in other words, from an evolutionary perspective, there is an inherent conflict of interest as well as overlapping interest between parent and child.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so when you say that perhaps children can develop certain kinds of strategies when it comes to the relationships they establish with their parents and then later in life with other people, that from an evolutionary perspective, perhaps they are rational in a way, even though perhaps from a modern perspective we might consider some of them to be negative.
Absolutely. I might not use the word rational because that suggests that, there's some thinking in the frontal lobes going on. Sure. So I would say strategic, functional. That is, it makes sense to develop, quote, disordered, dysregulated, dysfunctional, or at least as we contemporarily see things, under conditions of adversity. Because you're basically learning that the world is a hostile, not caring place, so it may be sensible to take advantage of others, i.e. before they take advantage of you. If you grow up in a world that's more supportive, more considered, more harmonious, then all of a sudden you learn that having reciprocal, positive, mutually beneficial social relationships pays off. But why would you do that if what life has taught you is just the opposite? So in other words, in both cases, whether we're developing in a modern view as well or badly, what we're doing is wearing the glove that fits the hand. We're developing in a way that makes functional strategic sense from the perspective of passing genes on to future generations, not from the perspective of health, wealth, and happiness necessarily. Because what evolution cares about first and foremost is the dispersion of genes in future generations. If securing health, wealth, and happiness is a means to do that, wonderful. But if undermining your own health and ultimately not achieving wealth and even being miserable gets that job done, or a greater chance of getting that job done, then that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And from a purely modern perspective, what are some of the criteria that we should consider when deciding to classify perhaps some mode of attachment as malfunctioning or something like that? That is, should we look at it as being an evolution, an evolved strategy that is maladapted to the current environments that we live in, to the modern environments that we live in, or perhaps should we classify something as diseased or malfunctioning if it brings negative consequences to the life of the person at hand or even the people surrounding her?
I think both of the views make some sense from this perspective. Certainly from a mental health perspective, in terms of what we contemporarily value in the modern, Western, educated world, then there are forms of insecurity that look problematical because if you're predisposed to not trust others and hit before you listen, because of the world you've grown up in, but you end up in a nice, wonderful school with lots of nice people, well, then you're kind of maladapted. But from the perspective of evolution, it doesn't expect that kind of radical change from earlier to later development. So from that perspective, what we call insecure is still functional. And it's as functional as being secure. It may be the right shoe for a particular foot, depending on what the organism has experienced. Now, having said that, I think one might look at disorganized attachment, which is the absence of any kind of coherent strategy in dealing with the parent-child relationship, as truly dysfunctional and disordered and maybe disease-like. But that's a whole different thing than our typical insecure avoidant and insecure resistant strategies, which to me make perfect sense as adaptations to current conditions in preparation for anticipated future conditions. Having said that, to repeat, if those future conditions that are anticipated don't emerge, as may often be the case in the modern world, then they're problematical. But it's not because they're a disease. It's because of what you described as we've almost got an old brain and an old body trying to function in an all too modern world. So there's a mismatch. But it's not inherently bad. It's just problematical in the modern world. So from that standpoint, it's really important that we don't moralize these things and saying this is the wrong, bad way for humans to develop. This is actually the right way for humans to develop given their history, even though it may not work very well today.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And when it comes to when we try to study and understand the ways people develop certain modes of attachment or the ways they establish relationships with other people, what are some of the most important factors that we have to take into account here? Do we have to consider, apart from the ways their parents established a relationship with them as children, also perhaps certain environmental aspects and also the personality of that specific person?
Well, I think when it comes to attachment security, the best evidence we have suggests that the sensitivity and the responsiveness and the appropriateness of the care that the baby and toddler receive, and therefore the child thereafter, is what shapes security or insecurity when that care is insensitive or unresponsive or inappropriate. Now, having said that, what we also need to do is contextualize that parent, because whether or not they're providing sensitive or insensitive care, and thereby probabilistically inducing security or insecurity, respectively, is going to be dependent in the broader world in which they function. Are they in a harmonious parent-adult relationship with their partner, or are they in a problematic, conflicted, even domestic violence relationship, or are they a single parent? And even that relationship inside the nuclear family is affected by what's going on beyond that nuclear family. Is it a dangerous neighborhood, or is it a safe neighborhood? Do I have a steady, secure source of income and a job that enhances my well-being, or just the opposite? So what we have to recognize is that sensitive or insensitive care, which fosters security or insecurity, itself is a function of these broader ecological stressors and supports. And in fact, I think that makes all the sense in the world, because you can almost look at some ways that when adversity characterizes the psychological and developmental experience of the parent, the insensitivity of the parent, which derives from that, is a way of conveying to the child that you live and you'll probably live in an insecure world. Become ready for it. So again, instead of seeing this as some dysfunctional, disease-ridden process, it's one that's strategic and sensible, even if we don't like it. And that suggests that if we don't like it and we want to change it, then we have to consider the broader ecology of the family, the intradynamics of the family, as well as the specifically derivative parenting that's going to probabilistically shape attachment security.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so could you now give us a brief account of what is the modern attachment theory and its relationship with knowledge that comes from human behavioral ecology, for example? Because I mean, attachment theory originally was developed by John Bowlby, right? But now it is a bit different from the proposals that he put forth, correct?
Well, I'm not sure it's as different as you imply for most people. For me, it's different, and for a few others, it's different. But let me make the contrast.
Okay.
Modern classical attachment theory, which is really remains the order of the day for most people, presumes that security is healthy and insecurity is unhealthy. That the organism evolved to develop security, more or less, and it's only when things went wrong that he diverted to insecurity. Mm-hmm. And whereas one led to the capability of establishing enduring intimate relationships, the other led to more opportunistic advantage taking. The alternative, more evolutionary-minded perspective, classed in a modern evolutionary perspective, emphasizing reproductive fitness, the dispersion of genes in future generations, says, wait a minute, neither security or insecurity or sensitive or insensitive care is more or less natural or the way we're supposed to develop. Rather, these are simply alternative ways of a functioning that have evolved through the course of Darwinian natural selection to respond to the conditions that the developing organism encounters. Think about it this way. When we go from a dark room into the light of day, and we can't see very well, and our pupils change, is that dysfunction or is that adaptation? It's clearly adaptation. Well, the same thing, we need to look at insecurity in the same way. And in fact, what work that I've done, which provides evidence for this view, is something that no classical attachment theory would ever predict. Namely, that insecure girls who are insecure in infancy are more likely to sexually mature earlier and faster than other girls. That fits very well a reproductive strategy point of view, a modern evolutionary point of view. Under conditions of adversity, I have to be concerned, not consciously necessarily, that I may not live to breed, or I may be too compromised to breed, or I may be too compromised to find a good mate, so I should hurry up to sexually mature to rid of all those reproductively problematic outcomes. There's nothing in classical attachment theory that would suggest that early insecurity should forecast somatic development, the timing of girls' first period. Only a modern evolutionary perspective on attachment theory can, on the one hand, anticipate that, thereby predict it, and thereby explain it now that findings such like that has emerged.
Mm-hmm. And what is the relationship between modern attachment theory and life history theory? Because from what you just said, and because I've already had a couple of conversations on my show specifically about life history theory, there seems to be some similarities, particularly when you were just talking about how when girls are exposed to certain environmental cues, they perhaps have their age of puberty onset varies according to certain aspects or certain types of information that they receive from the environment. It is somewhat similar to the difference between a fast-paced and a slow-paced life history strategy, right?
I think there's no incompatibility. In fact, all the modern evolutionary theory of attachment is the application of life history theory to classical attachment theory. So it's recasting classical attachment theory in life history theory / evolutionary psychology terms. And in fact, these are hypotheses. In fact, I recasted attachment theory back in 1991 in offering an evolutionary theory of socialization, which emphasized faster and slower reproductive strategy explicitly as epitomized by earlier and later pubertal development, because pubertal development was something that life history theory called my attention to because of its emphasis on reproduction, whereas it's nothing that classical attachment theory would ever have entertained. It's only when you take a evolutionary life history perspective and look through those lenses at classical attachment theory that you see things you wouldn't otherwise see, which led to the prediction that attachment security is going to affect pubertal timing, and led to the discovery in my work that in fact it does. And in so doing, challenge classical attachment theory. You know, the irony here is that Bowlby was the second evolutionary psychologist. The first evolutionary psychologist was Darwin. But Bowlby thought of attachment theory in kind of the old evolutionary terms. Survival of the species on the one hand, as opposed to a focus on the genetic considerations of the individual. And the only thing he really addressed, and the only thing contemporary, most classical attachment thinkers address, is the notion that the child has an attachment system because it afforded increased likelihood of the child surviving by not wandering away, by staying close and being protected way back in ancestral times. Well, the fact of the matter is, from the perspective of modern evolutionary theory, as well as even Darwinian classical thinking, the only reason survival matters is in the service of reproduction. That is, if you're just surviving, evolution does not, quote, reward that or select for that. What evolution rewards and selects for is survival in the service of reproduction. And perhaps the best evidence of that is that many an organism will put itself at risk of demise, i.e. death, in order to promote the survival and reproduction of its own genes. Think of that animal that issues a warning call. There's a predator around, letting all its kin run away to safety. But what has it done? It's increased its likelihood of predation, of being somebody's lunch, of dying. Well, why would natural selection select for such, behavior that will kill you? Why? Because when you consider all of that to be dead organism's genes in all its kin, well, there will be more of its genes in future generations because all the help it's given to multiple kin than it would get just by surviving. So therefore, it takes a risk and it increases the chances of its own demise because of the reproductive payoffs of that. So Bowlby's emphasis on survival was okay, but it wasn't cast in modern evolutionary terms, nor has classical attachment theory, quite frankly. And so we're still thinking about survival and well-being and health and happiness rather than reproductive success. And as long as we're doing that, we're misconstruing the nature of human development.
Mm-hmm. So would you say then that reproduction is even more important than survival from an evolutionary perspective?
Absolutely. That evolution rewards reproduction. It doesn't just reward survival.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and could you tell us what are the main attachment styles or modes of attachment that we have? You've been talking about secure and insecure attachment styles. What are some of the others?
Well, I don't think there really are others. What we think about is there's secure attachment. Mm-hmm. There are two forms of organized insecurity, insecure avoidance and insecure resistance. And then there's disorganization, which is a duck of a whole different color. So security is the notion that I'm confident that I'm cared for, that somebody's there for me, and that somebody will be responsive and meet my needs. And the presumption and some of the evidence is that sensitive parenting induces that. If we look at our two kinds of insecurity, the idea is that the insecure avoidant infant has basically learned that the parent doesn't want to hear about its needs and wants. And that when it shares those, the experience is discomforting, if not painful. And thus it's learned to keep those needs and wants inside and become detached and separate. It's still connected in a certain way, but it's not going to share everything. It's not going to be open all positive and negative feelings and share it with the caregiver. And so the notion is that these are the individuals who are at risk of growing up most likely to be aggressive and impulsive and even explosive at some point when their attempt to control all their emotions breaks down. Okay? And they will not be trustworthy and they will be opportunistic advantage takers. Now, then you have insecure, resistant, or more dependent infants. And these are infants, the theory goes, who have been inconsistently responded to. That is, sometimes the parents widely available, sensitive, appropriate, and responsive, and other times not. And what this child has kind of, quote, learned is that I've got to exaggerate or inflate my neediness to get you to pay attention. Whereas the insecure avoidant child was doing just the opposite, deflating, under expressing its needs and desires. So one has learned nobody wants to hear me and know me as much as I want to be known, where the other is more like, I get signals that they want to be known, but they're inconsistent signals, so I have to exaggerate my neediness in order for someone to get responded to. Now, I am very intrigued, especially by the latter, the insecure resistance from an evolutionary perspective, because it seems to me that the kind of inconsistent care that we see associated with insecure resistance is quote, designed or results in making a dependent clinging organism. Now, why would that make sense? Well, it might think of a persecuted people, be they Jews or Armenians or any other people who have been persecuted for a long time. Maybe perhaps what's going on here is this is the way the parent is signaling, don't trust anybody out there, even when they act trustworthy. Because you can't count on that trustworthiness. Only I can meet your needs. Whereas the parent who's inducing security isn't conveying that sensibility. And the parent who is conveying who is supporting insecure avoidance is kind of saying, I won't meet your needs. Go elsewhere. So these may be all strategic ways in which parents, given their own history and conditions, induce different understandings in their progeny that's dependent upon their own life histories and their own ecological circumstances. Mm-hmm. Disorganized attachment is a totally separate thing because it looks like an attachment system that is broken down, that is giving the organism no clues, consistent signals about everything, even inconsistent signals. Insecure resistant child is sending a message. But the disorganized child looks like it is just confused and doesn't understand how the world operates. And so I think that's very different. And in fact, that's the form of attachment insecurity that has been found to predict psychopathology. Whereas other forms of insecurity don't seem to predict true psychopathology to any great extent.
Mm-hmm. And what are the aspects of children's personality that we have to consider here? Because, I mean, isn't it true that even the same parenting style doesn't really have the exact same effects when done with different children that have different personalities or different personality traits? Because, I mean, I've also already talked with some behavioral geneticists, and there's even the phenomenon of reactive gene-environment correlation. That is when the parents adopt certain strategies in reaction to the ways that specific child behaves, right?
Yeah, I think individual differences in children are critically important. Mm-hmm. But we have to remember that all secure and all insecure avoidant or all insecure resistant children aren't exactly the same. There's variation among them. So you have, for example, when you measure attachment security, you have secure children who are prone to distress, who get very upset, but they also are capable of being comforted by their caregiver. You have other secure children who are much more resilient. They're not so stressed, they're not so easily upset, but they make psychological contact with their caregiver when she returns after a separation. So these children are temperamentally, personality-wise, very different. So security and personality are not alternative explanations. It's how personality interacts with security that will further affect personality. One can imagine, for example, a child predisposed to anxiety for genetic reasons, who with secure care learns to first co-regulate that security with the parent, and now can down-regulate it on its own, even though he or she is prone to high levels of anxiety. So it may kind of practice or discover the ability to practice its own cognitive behavioral therapy. When it starts to feel anxious, it distracts itself. It reconceptualizes the issue. Now we have the same predisposed personality to anxiety that grows up insecure. It does not learn to do that. So that insecurity and that anxiety comes to define its whole life. So we shouldn't think of either genetics or personality as inherently at odds with insecurity. You and I can take the same flour and eggs and sugar, and you can make a beautiful cake, and mine just collapses and burns. The same raw material, but depending how it's cooked, creates a very different outcome. Same raw ingredients, very different outcome because of how it's cared for.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and now when it comes to child maltreatment, from all of what we've been talking here, what are the most important aspects that we have to consider? And let's start with child maltreatment that derives from parent-offspring conflict.
I think to the extent that we have, parent-offspring conflict, as I've implied before, is inherent in the relationship because these two people don't have the same genetic interest. It's not 100% like it is between identical twins. It's rather 50%, just like it is between siblings. So that means there are going to be times when there's conflict in every relationship. The question becomes, does that conflict become uncontrollable? Does that parent lose emotional control and abuse the child? This is different than neglecting the child. And that's probably dependent, as I've already implied, on the ecological circumstances of that parent in terms of current situation and own personal developmental history. So you can imagine, here I want more than what you're giving me. And if I'm a well-cared for parent, that is well cared for in my childhood, who has a good job and or a good marriage and or a good living condition, well, I can tolerate that conflict and I can put up with some of that stress and I can be more patient and I can be more understanding. We don't have child abuse. Now imagine that same demandingness or refusal or a defiance on the part of the child, but I've been mistreated myself. I don't manage my own emotions very good. I don't get along with people very well. I live in a dangerous neighborhood, and or my marital relationship is highly conflicted, and or I'm unemployed or I have a demeaning job. Well, now all of a sudden, that conflict has the risk of spinning out of control. In fact, I'll tell a personal story here about having once walked into my home when I had 2 young children, and they were squabbling. And I walked into the house and heard them squabbling, and I was about to blow my top. And then I said something about, who do I want to be? And I realized I was upset and irritated and frustrated about things at work. It had nothing to do with my kids. So I took a deep breath. I walked into their room. I said, you guys want to continue playing, or do you want to stop playing and get on your bed? And they looked at each other and said, we want to keep playing. I said, okay. And they went about keep playing. Now, I was fortunate. I have a good job. I lived in a safe neighborhood. I had a reasonably supportive childhood history. So I could bring my psychological resources to bear, not to follow through with my initial irritability. And the same thing occurred when my first child was an incredibly difficult baby. I came away from the experience wondering with 2 senses. One was, why isn't there more child abuse? Because I felt so many times like throwing this kid against the wall. But again, I had the psychological resources to downregulate those feelings. And the other thing I came away with was, I'm glad we got them rather than somebody else who didn't have those capabilities.
Mm-hmm. Yes, some of what you've been talking about is what in biology people call redirected aggression, right? That is, if, for example, in my work, I am in some way or another abused by my boss, perhaps there's some days where I come home and I have the impulse to be aggressive toward my children or my spouse, right?
Exactly. We call it, within developmental psychology, we call it spillover. Mm-hmm. But again, some of us can, and you know, there are those who argue that really what matters here is what I referred to just before, which is a reflective ability. That some of us can reflect on what we're feeling and the situations. And that probably comes from having enough security so we can do so. Whereas if you yourself are insecure under threat, you don't have the psychological wherewithal, the resources to do that, or it's harder to do that. In fact, but the fact is it gets done. It's astonishing. You know, as I said, it's surprising to me that there's not more child abuse. Think of all those families that grow up with, that live under, you know, demanding, even horrific circumstances that don't abuse their children. Those people, for genetic or developmental reasons, seem capable of being patient, of being self-aware of what they're feeling, of regulating their behavior vis-a-vis what they're feeling, rather than just following through on feelings of frustration, of anger, of depression, of irritability, with all the untoward consequences that come from that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've been talking about relationships that people establish with other people that are genetically related to them. But now I would like to ask you specifically about daycare, because I guess that this is a very controversial topic of your work. But could you tell us what are some specific risks that children might be exposed to in daycare?
Well, let me recast that so that we're not only talking about risks but opportunities.
Okay.
Because as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to research on daycare, at least in my country, America, which is a critical consideration here for reasons I'll explain shortly,
okay,
there are both costs and benefits. There's what I call good news and bad news. The good news is that when you have attentive, responsive, skilled, i.e. sensitive caregivers, children's, especially their cognitive and linguistic development, seems to benefit from that somewhat. At the same time, for children in America who start their daycare arrangements very early in life, as most do, meaning in the first 6 months of life, for long periods of time, 20 or 30 hours per week, which continues until they start school, there's an increased risk of disobedience, noncompliance, and aggressive behavior to some extent. I don't want to exaggerate either the bad news or the good news. We're not talking catastrophe here at the individual level. We're not talking psychopathology here, okay? What we have to consider, though, we can't be glib about extrapolating or generalizing these findings from America to elsewhere without considering the public policy, i.e. the ecological context of American daycare. We have no paid parental leave. In this country, with the exception of a few states, including my own in California, a mother who's just given birth gets 12 weeks of unpaid leave. Well, not many people can afford unpaid leave. So not many people take a full 12 weeks of unpaid leave. So at the same time, we don't have a national policy to protect and enforce good quality daycare. And so what we end up with is what looks to me like a dysfunctional system or non-system. Now contrast that where I've also done research in Norway, where you get paid parental leave to a good degree, for the whole first year of life. So there's almost no infant daycare. It doesn't exist. Meanwhile, American kids have been in care since 3 weeks or 3 months for 20 to 30 hours a week of a variety of sorts of care. Also, in Norway, you have firm laws about what daycare should be, what quality is, and it gets enforced. And partly you get this good quality daycare because caregivers are reasonably well paid. And in fact, under these ecological and public policy conditions, we don't find the same bad effects of daycare in Norway. So from this perspective, we shouldn't be thinking about inevitable or inherent effects of daycare in all its varieties. We should be thinking about the conditions of daycare if we want to understand the likely effects. Now, having said that, I want to point something else out, which is that there's evidence, intriguingly, that the adverse consequences, as well as the beneficial consequences of daycare on individual children, can spread to other children who have not had similar daycare histories. So if you're in a kindergarten classroom in America and lots of kids have had poor quality, extensive daycare, kids who haven't had that history come to behave like those kids. It's almost like you're keeping up with the Joneses on the one hand, or that you have a viral infection on the other hand. And that's very intriguing because it suggests that we have to reconsider what small effects, either good or bad, at the individual level means for the school, the neighborhood, the community, the society. Because when these small effects affecting many kids also spread to other kids, then wow, you may have something rather different than you first thought, for better or for worse.
Let's now talk a little bit about differential susceptibility of different children to parenting styles. We've already talked a little bit about this before in the interview, but could you give us some more information about that?
In fact, this is a very important topic because it brings nature and nurture together in an evolutionary perspective, and also, and in so doing, it qualifies almost everything I've said. Because everything I've said risks implying that the effects I've talked about, be it sensitive care on attachment, or even ecological stress on parenting, or even maltreatment on children's development, it sort of implies that all children will be affected in the way I've described. But the truth is that doesn't make any sense. And we developmentalists haven't appreciated that. Why doesn't it make any sense? Because if you ask most people why it would make sense for what happens early in life to shape who we become later, the answer would be, well, what early life experiences are doing is preparing us to fit the later environment, and thereby increasing our chances to succeed in life, including reproductively succeed. Okay? But here's the problem with that analysis. The future is uncertain. That is, we can't be sure what tomorrow will bring. What that implies, therefore, is that if we're all equally susceptible to our parenting and other environmental influences early in life, and tomorrow turns out different, then we all go over the proverbial waterfall. None of us are fit for that future. That led me to think that evolution should hedge its bets. Some of us should be more susceptible, plastic or developmentally malleable strategists, and other of us should be less susceptible, fixed strategists, not particularly susceptible. And in fact, there's more and more evidence to that effect. If you look at temperament, physiology, and genetics, we see hints, if not strong evidence, that certain individuals benefit from enrichment and support more than others, and certain individuals suffer from adversity more than others, whether that support has to do with parenting or neighborhood or schooling. Now, what's fascinating here is But the data are also suggesting, and this is a contrast to classical thinking, that those who are most vulnerable to adversity and most likely to succumb are not just vulnerable, they at the same time are most likely to benefit from support and enrichment. In other words, they're not as classically thought of as vulnerable to adversity in so much mental health research that only focuses on bad experiences and bad development. They are likely to flourish under good conditions. In other words, they have a huge, wide range of reaction. Under adverse conditions, they sink, so to speak. Under positive, supportive conditions, they flourish. Now, what's interesting here is that those kids who are resilient to adversity, which looks like a benefit, don't look very responsive and likely to benefit from support and enrichment. In other words, they're the fixed strategist. So neither being developmentally plastic or less developmentally plastic, even fixed, is better or worse. It depends. If you grow up under a supportive environment and end up in one, then being developmentally malleable makes sense. If you grow up in an unsupportive environment and end up in one, then being developmentally malleable makes sense, because both of these have enabled you to better fit tomorrow. However, if tomorrow is different than your early experiences, then maybe you're better off being a fixed strategist. That is, you're going to be who you are, irrespective of what your experiences and exposures are for the most part. And in fact, there's evidence out there to suggest that certain genes, or being physiologically reactive, or having a negatively emotional temperament early in life, identify kids who are both vulnerable and hopeful. In fact, one of the really culturally interesting things is I've never been able to find a language that has a word that's the opposite of vulnerable. That is, what do you call somebody who's disproportionately likely to benefit from support and enrichment? There's no word for it in any language. Although for those who are disproportionately likely to succumb to adversity, they're vulnerable. Maybe we haven't recognized differential susceptibility, and especially the notion that the most vulnerable or the most likely to benefit, because we haven't had a word, we haven't had a concept for those most likely to benefit from support and enrichment. And what I've said seems to be supported not only by observational research, which is always questionable from a causal analysis perspective, but from experimental research. That is, people are now discovering that when they look at the effects of intervention programs designed to enhance child well-being or even adult mental health, that not only is the case that some benefit more than others, but the very characteristics that look like they made people succumb to adversity identify people who are likely to benefit from enrichment. The very characteristics that look like they made individuals resilient to adversity seem to identify people who are least likely to benefit from interventions. So that suggests that some people benefit more from services and interventions than do others. And that raises interesting policy implications that we may or may not want to go into.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very interesting. And so, from an evolutionary slash biological perspective, would you say then that different individuals exhibit different degrees of phenotypic plasticity when it comes to certain developmental aspects? Is that correct?
Well, it's a really good question. I cast it this way. Is this developmental plasticity, or this variation in developmental plasticity, domain general or domain specific? That is, let's imagine that you're fixed and I'm plastic. Okay? Am I plastic to everything with regard to all possible outcomes? And you're not plastic to anything with regard to all plastic outcome or all developmental outcomes? That seems unreasonable. It seems unlikely. So my suspicion is, although we don't have evidence of this, quite frankly, that we're each mosaics of plasticity. In fact, you can think of a bell curve. At the rare extremes, we have people who are highly malleable, responsive to almost all developmental experiences and exposures. At the other extreme, we have people who are not at all malleable to any developmental experiences and environmental exposures. And in the rest of the curve, we have people who are variably malleable. more versus less. So although I may talk about plastic and fixed strategists and suggest there are two types, it's probably more a gradient, where some people are more developmentally malleable for better or for worse, and some people are less developmentally malleable. And in fact, there's some research that I and others have done using polygenic scores that show this, that the more of a certain set of genes that you have, the more malleable you are for better and worse. The fewer of those genes that you have, or those genetic variants you have, the less malleable you are. So you have some who have many, some who have fewer, some who have fewer still, and some who have very few of those genetic variants. And so you get a gradient of the degree to which their future functioning looks like it's shaped by their developmental experiences and exposures.
Mm-hmm. And would this developmental plasticity, should we expect this to have any sort of correlation with personality traits, like, for example, the big 5 personality traits?
It's a good question. We don't have much evidence of that. But that's not to say it's not so. So I think the sad truth is that we kind of accidentally almost, well, while I advanced differential susceptibility thinking on the basis of first principles, theoretical first principles, as I've outlined in terms of the future being uncertain, when it came to identifying characteristics that seemed to make people more versus less developmentally responsive, for better and for worse, that came out of mostly psychiatric genetic research, where they were only looking for what made people vulnerable. And in fact, often in those studies, they had evidence that the very vulnerable people, the very characteristics that make people vulnerable, if they're not faced with adversity, they do better. But they didn't see that because they weren't looking for that. What we haven't had, and hopefully we will have, are people saying, what characteristics a priori should facilitate plasticity or not? And if you think it's this big 5 characteristic or that big 5 characteristic, then go out and do research and test that hypothesis. In other words, it's been mostly like we're picking up crumbs from sandwiches we didn't make, rather than making the sandwiches we'd like to eat, and thereby identify characteristics of individuals that make them more and less susceptible for better and for worse.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Belsky, let's end the interview here, but just before we go, would you like to share with us what would be some of the best online sources if people want to get in touch with more of your work?
I would just Google J. Belsky. There's a lot of stuff out there, including, videotape lectures, and I would recommend people go look at those. Sad truth is, I'm an old geezer. I don't keep a rich website with lots of stuff, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Okay, anyway, I will be leaving links to some of your work in the description box of this video. And Dr. Belsky, again, thank you a lot for taking the time to be here with us today. And it was a very interesting conversation. So,
you're most welcome. It was my pleasure.
Hi there, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started my channel last year and I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there, or alternatively you can also do it on PayPal or Subscribestar. I will leave all the links in the description box. Otherwise, if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, and my first producer, Izar Webb. Thank you for